Come with me. Thank you. Yes, my name is Paul Couillard. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I've been working as a performance artist and curator since the mid-1980s. And the talk I'm going to give today, I've called Sensing Time, Dwelling in Durational Performance. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about durational performance, what it is, because I don't think there's one clear definition that everyone agrees on. And I would also like to think with you about what it means to do durational performance and how it may be different from other types of performance, and a sort of concept of dwelling, as the title suggests, that thinks about how in the space of the performance, unlike on a stage where people might be thinking of it as a world apart from their reality where they act something or channel something out for a period of time, the time that we hive off as performance in a durational performance is still time that we're living that time. So we're basically continuing to live our lives even if our behaviors or our activities are a bit different from everyday life. So if we're going to break down this term, durational performance, I think we have to start with thinking about what is performance. So I'm going to pull up just a couple of quotes from different performance studies thinkers who've talked about what they think performance is. And Ellen Diamond says, performance may be seen as cultural practices that conservatively reinscribe or passionately reinvent the ideas, symbols, and gestures that shape social life. So what this quote already tells us is that performance exists in a human world, in a social world, and it's really about our interactions with each other. And Ellen Diamond suggests that some performance actions are working to ground us in the culture that already exists, to try and keep us netted or kind of grounded in the world in the way as we already know it, so that there's not too much dissension or argument. But on the other hand, she says, performance can also be used in the exact opposite way to kind of imagine new ways of being and new ways of behaving in the world. So performance is not just a way of behaving, it's a way of shaping behavior. And the other quote that I'll refer you to is by Marvin Carlson, where he says, "The recognition that our lives are structured according to repeated and socially sanctioned modes of behavior raises the possibility that all human behavior could potentially be considered as performance, or at least all activity carried out with a consciousness of itself." So what this suggests is that performance doesn't have to be in this frame of, oh, I put up a poster and said between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock I'm doing this thing in a particular space. It's saying we perform all the time for each other. And the key line here is that he points out this idea of a consciousness of itself. So performing happens when we're aware that we're behaving in a certain way for particular reasons. So we use this generic term performance, but we're also familiar with this term performance art. And I think it's important to think about what does this word art attached to performance mean. So the artist Ulrike Rosenbach suggests that it's Vito Acconci who first came up with the term performance art. I don't know if that's true, but that's what she writes about. And she says, well, what did he mean by that? She says, well, performance doesn't actually mean anything but a presentation of some kind or another. And the term was used by Acconci to mean, it was meant to be ironic, an irony on appearing in public or presenting, or on presenting and representing oneself. So again, this same idea of a consciousness of oneself and how one presenting oneself. Now, if we look to art historians, Christine Stiles suggests that performance art really begins when artists start to think of their bodies as the material of the art itself. So she says, the artists who began to use their bodies as the material of visual art repeatedly expressed their goal to bring art practice closer to life in order to increase the experiential immediacy of their work. So their powerful declaration of the body as form and content insisted on the primacy of human subjects over objects. So here we get closer to this idea of art as life as opposed to art as representation of life. And Rosalie Goldberg, of course, comes up with a very succinct description of performance art as live art by artists. Now, I bring up Rosalie Goldberg because if you're familiar with her book, she basically takes the idea of performance art and goes back to a historical period before the term itself existed to identify things like Dadaist performance as being part of this tradition of performance art, and then carries it forward, looking at how different genres and, different artists have kind of done what we now consider to be performance art. And as I've come to discover, that's the way most schools teach performance art, of looking at a kind of historical perspective of these different approaches that have been used by artists. But I didn't go to art school. I discovered performance by coming to a gallery and seeing an artist, Rachel Rosenthal from Los Angeles, doing a performance and being completely stunned by it and thinking afterwards, this is what I have to do with my life. So she was based in Los Angeles, and indeed I went to Los Angeles and studied with her to find out more about what performance art was. So I didn't know the formal history of who is considered to have done performance in art. And Rachel talked about performance in terms of its basic elements. She asked, what, if painting is about having a ground and a pigment, what are the basic elements, the basic things that make up a performance? And she said they're time, space, and the performer's body. But aren't these just the elements of life? We have time, we have space, and we have our bodies. So I thought about it further, and I added another element, which is a relationship between performer and audience, which I think is what delineates the difference between thinking we're just living and thinking we're actually performing. And to think about performance in this way, rather than being tied to the frame of how other artists had done art, had done performance, historically through the 20th century, I thought more in terms of what are recognized performance situations. So it didn't have to be an art context. Ritual, sports, social gatherings, and performing arts are all different sort of traditions that we can draw upon in thinking about performance. And to think about how performance art might differ from the performing arts generally, what I came up with is, in terms of thinking about it, is that perhaps performance art is any kind of use of these elements in a way that's not already understood or prescribed within a discipline. So when we go to a theater, we know what to expect as an audience. We know how we're supposed to behave as an audience. But if we play with any of these elements, whether it's time, space, the performer's body, or the way we relate to the audience, this is where a territory opens up for something called performance art that can be dynamic and constantly changing. So what I started doing as both an artist and a curator to learn what performance art might be was not to look back at, oh, this is what Marina Abramović did, or this is what Vito Acconci did. Instead, I started thinking from these radical root elements of how do we play with time? How do we play with space? How do we play with our bodies? And how do we play with the relationships we have with? And time is obviously one of those elements. So durational performance, what does that term mean? I mean, often we think it just means a really long performance. So, Is there a specific time that signals, okay, it's durational performance when it's 4 hours or longer? It's a question. I'm not saying that is a good or a bad definition. Some artists have suggested that it has to do with an attitude toward the way you approach your actions. If it's something you repeat over and over again, or that works cyclically or rhythmically, or has a kind of consistency of action, that's really what duration is about, where there's this kind of ongoing repetition. Or is durational performance really about crafting actions or exploring actions that draw attention to the influence and effects of time? So while you think about those questions and possible definitions, now I will try to move into a slightly more anecdotal approach to talking about some of the work I've done and curated. So the first durational performance I did in 1995, I actually wasn't thinking specifically about duration. I was thinking about the body of the performer and the bodies of the audience and what that meant. And I started a series called 5 Holes relating to the traditional 5 senses. So the first one was about sight, the vision. So unfortunately, there's no documentation existing of that work, but what I did was I set up what was essentially like a peep show, where each of the artists were in different curtained off areas, and the audience could only look through little holes to see what the artists were doing. And I was really thinking in terms of a situation where people would come and go and wouldn't necessarily be watching continuously for 6 hours. But for some reason, I decided it should be 6 hours long. And for me, being in this space for 6 hours, there was a big freedom in the idea that, oh, an artist is only looking for a couple of minutes, or an audience member is only looking for a couple of minutes. So I can repeat my actions, I can do whatever I want. Every time somebody's looking, it's fresh, and I don't have to necessarily sustain anything for an extended period of time. And I had a great time, but some of the other artists who were performing encountered a huge difficulty because after a few hours, they felt like they ran out of things to do, and they felt very exposed, even though they were in this space where they couldn't even see the audience. So I guess I was sort of finding a form that was comfortable for me without really understanding or knowing how other people's approach might be. But at that time, as I said, I wasn't really, the idea that the duration was important had not yet really sunk in or occurred to me. So the next year, the little sort of collective group of artists that I'd formed at the time called Fado had connections with an artist-run center in Quebec called Le Lieu, run by Richard Martel. In fact, Tokyo was part of that festival in 1996. And we invited 10 artists from Quebec to come, and 5 additional artists from Toronto were chosen to do a kind of mini festival in Toronto. So for that festival, I did another long performance where I was dressed up in a papier-mâché suit, and basically I started off at a location near my home and ended up at the end of 4 or 5 hours, 5 hours, I guess, at the venue, which was about 1.5, 2 kilometers away.
So slowly, you just move.
Yeah, I'd station myself in a spot, and then I would move a few feet, and this way made my way down what is a major street in Toronto called Queen Street West. Mm-hmm. And other than presenting myself as this image in a rocking chair, and I'd rock back and forth, the piece was called Lull. I didn't have any big action I was doing other than just putting this strange image into kind of the public eye. Mm-hmm. And then for the final action in the space, which was an hour long, then I did something that was more like, I would say, a traditional performance. Mm-hmm. But I still wasn't really thinking in terms of duration. However, during that festival, another artist named Roddy Hunter appeared. And he did a durational performance of 6 hours, all in the performance space. And he was doing actions, like he had measuring tapes that he would pull out and he'd sort of snap them on the floor and draw them back in. And he'd do simple things, repetitive actions, like he'd come to the chairs in the audience and he'd reorient them and move them around over time, slow time, just things happening that I had just never seen anything quite like this before, and I was completely captivated by this way of interacting with a space and with the audience. In his performance, I really felt this sense of time passing and somehow his simple actions changing the quality of how time felt so that it felt either shorter or more extended. And I'd say that's where my true interest in the idea that durational performance could be its own form and thinking about how do we approach time really took root as an idea that captivated me as an artist. So by the following year, having done this mini festival, galvanized the city I was living in, Toronto, in a way that a whole bunch of artists came together and decided to start an international performance art festival called 7A11D, which still exists today, and I'm still part of the collective. So for that festival, on the final day of the festival, I decided to do a 24-hour performance. It was called Encounters, and I was really thinking about all these people who were coming from different places, of the audience, and how one hosts and interacts and meets with other people. So my performance took place in what was basically a storefront gallery. So it was open to, there was a big window open to the street. And for that 24 hours, which started at midnight and then ended on the final midnight of the festival, I decided I would be baking bread. So there was an oven in the back and people would see me kneading the bread. So over 24 hours, I was able to make 24 loaves of bread. And then the other action that I was doing was washing people's feet. And the important thing for me was this kind of social space that got set up in terms of doing these very domestic everyday action of making bread, but also this unusual action of washing people's feet. But of course, washing another person is something you do in your family if you wash your child's body or something like that. But it's very unusual, of course, to wash a stranger's feet in public. But the space really became the kind of hangout space for everybody who was involved with the festival, who'd show up for a few hours, talk, chat, talk about what they'd seen, talk about what they were going to see. It was a very social, relaxed, fun kind of space to be in. And my one stipulation to everybody who came was they had to leave something. Could be something from their pockets, like an empty candy wrapper or, a coin. But I also had, for those who didn't have things in their pockets, I had, a Polaroid camera, tape recorder, paper and pens and things, so people could make little artworks or just little objects that were accumulating in the space over the 24 hours as well. And this request of the audience was a way of seducing them to engage in the action, to become part of it, to feel that they were part of the action. They weren't just there to watch me perform, but that they were there in a social space where they were as much contributors as I was. It was a time we were all spending together. And then at the end of the 24 hours, we ate the bread together. We broke bread and we all ate together. And that was kind of the end of the festival and the end of that action. So the next year at the so in the meantime, So duration had started to be something that was really something I was interested in doing in my performances. So this is a performance I did in Chicago, a 12-hour performance called Ashes, where over that period of time I made this kind of visual art object on the floor out of spices and pigments, and did this kind of tableau image. And really at that point, it was in the midst of the AIDS crisis. A lot of my friends had died because I'm a gay man myself, and I needed some way to think about memorializing all of those people who died. So you see, I was also slowly wrapping myself in bandages over the course of 12 hours while I was also making this kind of sculpture that I hoped had a kind of, for me, it was a very personal expression of looking for healing or looking for a larger spiritual connection. So on the one hand, I was thinking about very social gestures that really drew other people in and worked kind of through encounter. And on the other hand, I was also exploring gestures that were very private and personal, that were essentially rituals that would then be put on a kind of public display. Our next festival came around, the second year, 1998, and there was a kind of public space that was on the fourth floor of a building that had this very interesting freight elevator. And I was still interested in this idea of hosting and encounters. This was a silent performance, so basically I passed around these cards to everybody that are like a sort of like dating ad. Yeah. So I was at this freight elevator. People would show up at the elevator, and I would invite one person in at a time. But the elevator wasn't properly lit, so I would also hand them a flashlight. I was not speaking. And for me, the interest was, could I set up a relationship where, despite this very weird situation, by the end of it, they would be comfortable enough that we could have some kind of actual touch interaction. And so, as I said, the elevator was very dark. It was like a freight elevator that you have to sort of operate by hand and hold the button down till you hit the floor and make sure it's all lined up properly. And there was a huge metal door that you'd have to pull down, and then a second door that you'd swing across. So it was quite a production going through this process of going from floor to floor. And so people would be there waiting at the fourth floor. They would get on the elevator, and then they would disappear. And then eventually I would reappear alone for the next person. So people are lined up, I want to do this thing. So they'd show up at the fourth floor. I'd open the door. They would come in. And then the elevator would disappear. But when I reappeared again, I would be alone. Of course, a huge part of the performance takes place only in the minds of the audience, wondering what's going to happen, where am I going to end up, what is this, what is happening here? So there you can see one of the metal doors. So on each floor, when people would arrive, I had a different table set up. So the first one, I'm offering them vegetables. And then on the next floor, if they haven't eaten the vegetable before we get to the next floor, they discover there's a dip for them to dip the vegetables in. And then on the next floor, there's a glass of juice or water for them. So in a way, it was a kind of deconstruction of the elaborate steps we need to go through as hosts in order to make our guests comfortable. And then, of course, on the bottom floor, I would leave them so they could make their way back upstairs. But it was up to them to kind of play the game. I could, of course, I wasn't speaking. And usually I would try and shake their hand or have some kind of physical contact with them that seemed comfortable between the two of us. But it was up to them to then go back to the space and not reveal what had happened to the remaining audience members. So for me, even though I was only with each person a few minutes, it was really a durational performance because I had so many tasks of how in this short period of time can I introduce people to this strange situation and yet make them comfortable enough to feel that they're willing to, embrace me or shake my hand or something at the end without speaking to them. The extended time and uncomfortability of this slow descent of the elevator and the humming mechanism of the elevator and this moving of the gates so that people can open and close and come in and out. Even though the performance was very short, time was really present in terms of wondering, how long is this going to last? What's going to happen next? Where is this going? Even though the performance with each person was very short, for me it was a durational performance because time was so imbued in the possibility of the performance itself. So, because we now had this festival, and I was getting very interested in durational performance and discovering other artists who did durational performance and starting to kind of like wonder, who are these people? What have they done? I proposed to the group that did the festival that we should do a festival just on the theme of this durational performance. And they said to me, well, no, that would be the whole festival and we want to do different things. So why don't you go off and do that with this other little group you formed, Fado? So I sort of took my hurt feelings and thought, well, maybe they're right. I will do that. And I did. So I created a series called Time, Time, Time. And at first I was thinking, I guess it should be a festival because that's how we see a lot of international artists together at one time. But I realized since one of the premises of the event was each artist had to do a performance that was a minimum of 12 hours long, I thought, I can't do this as a festival because as the organizer, I'll die if I'm trying to do 12 performances in a row that are each 12 hours long. So since I was thinking about time, I thought, well, what if I did one a month for 12 months, starting in January and going to December? Then we could also think about what this year is as a project as well, rather than thinking of only the 12 hours of the performance. And my question in doing this work was really, why are people doing this work? Why do people find it interesting to do durational performance? What does it offer that other kinds of performance maybe don't? So really for me, that was my question of why is this so interesting? Why do artists do it? What do they find is useful about it in terms of their explorations? So I did this 12-month series. Just as an aside, one of the surprising things that happened was that about halfway through the series, I suddenly realized that basically it was like running an artist-run center because I had programming every month for 12 months and had received funding to do it from all levels of government. So suddenly I was qualified to consider this an artist-run center, and through that, Fado actually became an established artist-run center with a staff and continues today as an organization. But this was just an outcome that I hadn't expected, that came out of approaching duration in this way, really. So I invited these 12 artists, and I thought I should start with Linda Montano, because I knew that she was an American artist who had done this one-year project with Téchincier where they had been tied to each other with a rope for a year. And I knew she was doing these 7-year chakra projects where for a whole year she would wear articles of clothing that were a single color related to a chakra. So she was very invested in this idea of duration and also the idea of making her whole life an art project. So if you go on the website, you can see not all of the information is there, but there's information about each of the projects. Often there are eyewitness accounts of what happened, or interviews with the artists, or both. And in some cases, there's documentation of the projects themselves. So, I encourage you to visit the Fado website, which is performanceart.ca, easy to remember if you're interested in these projects. So after Linda invited Alistair McLennan, who did a her piece was 12 hours, where basically it started off with a kind of 3.5-hour public presentation where she invited 7 local artists each to embody one of the chakras and which are all related, of course, to different parts of the body, and thinking about those parts that in themselves that required healing. So we did a kind of soundscape happening with projections and bubble machines and people lying on the floor on couches, and it was very much almost like a rave atmosphere where things wash over you. And then at the end of 3.5 hours, suddenly the lights went on. It was very abrupt. And this was a request of Linda because she wanted people to not go home in this kind of spaced out state and maybe be dangerous. But then anyone who wanted to stay was permitted to, as long as they agreed to then stay until the end of the performance. And basically, we pulled all the mattresses together and everybody was asked to sleep for 7 hours while Linda meditated on our chakras and kind of healing on our behalf. And then at the end of the 7 hours, we woke everybody up by putting a little cup of tea beside them, and then everybody woke up, and those who wanted to speak about their experiences, whether what they had dreamed or what they'd thought about or what they'd experienced, could. And then at the end, we all went home. Then I invited Alistair McLennan, who did a 30-hour piece, each hour representing 1 year of the Troubles in Ireland, the sort of war or dispute between Catholics and Protestants. So he set up a giant table, and each hour he would set one place setting at the table with simple items like a teacup with water and a floating candle in it. He would set up an alarm clock, one black balloon, a plate with 2 pieces of paper, which were basically maps of Belfast. And throughout the 30 hours, there was a soundtrack playing, which was a male and a female voice reading the names of everyone known to have died in the Troubles, which would take about 3.5 hours to read all of the names and then would loop. And he also had strips of paper with these names that he was, laying out on the table as well, kind of almost like confetti. And when he wasn't setting a place setting, he would be doing very slow, sort of tableau, ritualistic actions, circling the table in a very slow, solemn manner, sometimes carrying odd items like, it could have been from a bombed out house or things like that. A child's shoe. And the other thing he was laying out on the table were fish and pig's ears. So what happened over the 30 hours was that slowly, as the fish and the pig's ears were decomposing, this odor of death was slowly, very slowly, sort of permeating out from the table, taking a wider and wider radius. So here we see someone who's really working on time on many levels. On the one hand, he's marking the 30 years with the place settings. On the other hand, he's stretching our sense of time by his slow ritualistic movements and by the rhythmic sound of the names of the dead that are repeating in alphabetical order. And it also, the way the materials are changing over time are changing the space. So there's really many different levels on which he's allowing us access points into thinking about time. So I won't go through all 12 projects because we'd be here for many hours, but so one project I will highlight is this piece called Clock, which was by 2 Canadian artists, Glenn Redpath and, what was her name?
Glenn, yeah, what's that?
It's embarrassing. Jennifer Nelson. Jennifer Nelson. She's American and Glenn is Canadian. So these two had met each other and they were kind of doing some collaborations together. Glenn is a marathon runner, among other things. They're both artists, but Glenn is a marathon runner. And Jennifer was trained in Buto dance. So they went to Nathan Phillips Square, which is the where the basically city government building is. And there's a large reflecting pool. And they decided to create themselves as a human clock. So over the course of 12 hours, Jennifer did a very slow kind of Buto walk around the pool that took her 12 hours to do one circuit. And during the same 12 hours, Glenn was running around the pool, approximately one revolution per minute. So he ran the equivalent of 3.5 marathons in 12 hours. And they were both dressed in gray with a red scarf. So not that, it's not like they stood out by some, they looked very ordinary in a lot of ways, as anybody in the square. But every time Glenn would pass Jennifer, he would just kind of try and brush her very lightly, just to sort of reestablish that connection between their two bodies. So it's a very interesting public space because some people stay there for a long period of time. A lot of people are just passing through. Some people are cutting across to get to somewhere else. There are busloads of tourists that show up regularly who kind of all come out and filter, this is the city hall, and take pictures and then get back on the bus and leave. So there's a lot of public activity and people there who are paying attention in quite different ways. And of course, a lot of people wouldn't even notice what they were doing, but it was very interesting to be there for 12 hours and to watch who would notice, when they would notice, and then how they would kind of process in their heads what they were seeing once they sort of figured, she's going slow and he's going fast and they're sort of dressed the same. It would be interesting to see when and if people would sort of clue into what was happening. So, as you can see, the projects took on very different tones. Each artist was approaching it in their own way, and people had very different ideas of how they addressed this question of minimum of 12 hours. The longest one was 72 hours. Alistair's was 30, so there was a range of different times within the performances themselves. And as I said, there's quite a lot of information on the website, so you can pick up on a lot of these projects. I was talking about the Time series that I curated in 1999. One of the great things about this series is that I had so much opportunity to talk with these artists about what they do. And you'll see there's a number of interviews that I did with the artists on the website, starting with Linda Montano and my article called I Slept with Linda Montano, which is probably my most reprinted article because even though it's on the website, it's actually been reprinted in several books. But I wanted to just highlight a few quotes from some of those interviews to talk about some of the questions that I think are very pertinent to duration and performance. So these are just a few quotes I'd like to talk about. So one of the things Linda Montano said to me was, working with time allows for a timelessness. So you almost have to grab time and go out of time. Focus and concentration and discipline and spaciousness all happen at the same time when you work with endurance and time. It inhibits scatteredness. It inhibits shallowness. It helps us go to places that change brain waves, literally. If something's done for a long period of time, then brain chemistry changes. All of those things interest me. So, I think this really is something that artists who work with duration are thinking about, of how do I go deeper into the work, and by spending more time and really focusing on it, by finding a space of time that they hive off to really focus on a particular issue or question or behavior, is really crucial to this practice of duration. So an artist may say what they're doing is a meditation, even though to someone watching from the outside it might not seem like a meditation. These kinds of intentions to really go deeply into the work, I think, are generally there in artists who are really trying to work with duration. So the way Alistair MacLennan explains it is, time is what we all live in and through. So I use time as a medium. So he's saying, he's literally tackling time as his material. In a usual day, people maybe work for a bit, sleep for a bit, eat for a bit, have some recreation. But if one breaks that pattern and does some kind of ritual work or engages in art activity that takes up the whole of that time, day and night, then different kinds of experiences open up. So we can say we're opening up to different kinds of experience, or I think we could also say we may be opening up to the same experiences, because often they're everyday experiences in these performances, differently. So different experiences, but also the same experiences experienced differently. So I wanted to highlight some comments from Rebecca Belmore, who's a Canadian artist. She was the third person in the series. She did a 12-hour piece called Manifesto, actually in the same space where I did the Encounters piece you saw earlier at the Storefront Gallery. And basically for 12 hours, she was all dressed in white at a table with a white tablecloth. She had a series of pencils and large, beautiful vellum paper. And for 12 hours, she was writing what she considered to be her manifesto. And as she was writing, she would speak the words aloud, and they were being mic'd so that from outside, where we were watching her, we could hear her on two speakers mounted above the windows. So it was a very simple image of this indigenous woman dressed in white, writing, and there was also a pencil sharpener with the container taken off, so that slowly as she would write and resharpen her pencils, there was a little mound of shavings that was piling up on the front window ledge. And for her, it was a very difficult performance. It was very different from any performance she'd done before. And she's not a writer per se, so she would really struggle. But in her, she was really laying bare her struggle and all of her thoughts as she would write them on the paper. She's really expressing them aloud to us watching from outside the window. And then at the end of this 12 hours, she opened the doors and had an opening to reveal this, beautiful stack of papers that she'd written, but they were sort of presented in a way that we couldn't really read the text on all the pages. We could just see it as an object. And of course, the shavings of the pencils and stuff. So essentially, her process then became this beautiful but impenetrable object. So you would get a very different impression whether you just came for the opening and saw the object, or whether you were there during the 12 hours listening to her struggle. And after the event, I think Rebecca really didn't know how to process what had happened. The interview I did with her was more than a year after the event, and she said in that time she had never spoken about that performance or what had happened during it. She couldn't talk about it with her friends, with her partner, with anybody. And so this was kind of the first time she was opening up and talking about what happened in that performance. And later she took that stack of papers and she shredded it all and reformed it in the shape of a human body. And she's exhibited that, but never the original text is gone forever. But when I had my interview, I was very struck with this performance and the vulnerability and the honesty of it when I was watching it. And, to watch an artist going through something and say, at one point, right, this is crap, I don't know what I'm doing, blah, blah, like all of this kind of emotion being laid bare for anyone on the street to see. And of course, the window glass was actually quite thin, so she could hear perfectly well when people were talking on the street. So even though people were talking and it was through a glass, so they thought, in a way, she can't hear what she's saying, she could hear perfectly well when they were saying things like, oh, how much is she getting paid for this? And they call this art, and these kinds of reactions you get from just people passing by on the street who's trying to figure out what's going on. But what I was really struck by was the way she stayed with it. So whatever she was feeling in the moment, she'd write it down. She didn't put down her pen and give up, or, it's like she had committed to this, and whatever was happening, that's where she held herself in that moment. So when I asked herself how she managed to sort of maintain that staying in the moment, which is something I think many artists are always looking for. I want to be in this moment. I want to stay in this moment and not allow my mind to go off somewhere else. She said, I remember it as coming at the problem or that point by switching directions, going in circles, the confusion and the frustration, sometimes thinking I had a good idea and I was on my way, and then suddenly getting trapped again somewhere else. I think that says a lot about human beings and the way we operate. So she felt it as something like, oh, I'm trying to approach something and I keep getting sort of kicked out. But what I saw was her being true to showing us, okay, I'm approaching something and now I've been kicked out again. And so even though she felt she was trying to get at this thing and she couldn't get at it, she was never not revealing to us where exactly she was in the process. And for me, this is something essential about why I'm interested in durational performance, because when I do these 24-hour performance actions, I have a plan, and I'm always hoping that at some point I'll be aware enough to understand where the plan's no longer working and to see what I call the doors and the windows that are available to go somewhere else with it. Because in a 15-minute performance, you don't have time to do anything but stick to your plan. But in a 24-hour performance, I know there's going to be a moment where suddenly I think, what am I doing here? This is stupid. Why did I invite these people to see this? Why would anyone want to watch this? Why am I doing this? What's going on here? What have I set myself up for? And it's in that moment that I have to then strip back to the most basic part of myself and say, okay, what action can I do in this moment that I believe in, that's true to this moment? However simple it is, however stupid it may seem, what can I do that I can still commit to? And for me, it's that moment that's the whole reason for the performance, to find out, what do I still have faith in? What can I find faith in? Because for me, performance is about meaning making. It's in a way, the world is just chaos. It has no meaning except the meaning that we create, the meaning that we find, the meaning that we discover through our being. So for me, it's a process of meaning making. And so confronting that moment of what do I have faith in is a moment of discovering meaning. Mm. And it's a very challenging thing to do because, certainly there's a part of us who wants to entertain, who wants our audience to be happy, who wants people to be engaged with us, who hopes that what we're doing is interesting to you as well, not just ourselves, because there's a reason why we're doing it in front of an audience. It's partly for the accountability that an audience gives me. By being witnessed, I have to be true. But I also hope that something reaches out and speaks and has meaning for other people as well. So that brings me to a comment by Tanya Mars, who did a piece called Hot, which was really about her becoming a postmenopausal woman. She wears a beard during the performance, and she did it as 2 12-hour actions where she's setting mousetraps in sort of an elaborate pattern on the floor, and then after 2 days, she sets them all off. And the mousetraps are set with cinnamon hearts, so as they break, this smell of cinnamon is released into them. But in this case, the room was very dimly lit and sort of pink. You had to walk through an image of her projected breasts to come into the space, and Sati music was playing throughout. So it had a very atmospheric kind of feeling. So here what we're saying is something very interesting. The artists suddenly changing their tactics from the way they had performed all their life up into their 50s, 60s, and then becoming interested in a different thing. So she writes, my previous theory was 15 minutes maximum and then get out. Leave them, keep them laughing, keep them wanting more. And she says, here I was challenging myself, asking whether audiences would be interested in repetition. I dealt with many layers of repetition. So it was the interesting thing about the action was for most of the 24 hours, because it was 2 12-hour days, it was her setting these mouse traps, and then occasionally she would do her exercises because, a lot of bending and lifting, and she has an aging body, which could be interesting to watch, but isn't like a spectacle. It's just this slow moving progression that builds up to this one fantastic, crazy moment at the end when all the mouse traps start going off, and as they pop and snap, that hits the next one, and it becomes a kind of domino effect, and there's this crazy explosion at the end, but 99% of the piece is this slow buildup of tension and anticipation, as opposed to this one moment that we're all waiting for at the end. But in this case, I'd say the anticipation is everything. Without that lull, that trance state that everybody's in, the ending wouldn't feel like much of anything. Of course, it's hard to orchestrate these things. Roddy Hunter, who had done that performance that got me interested in duration in the first place, of course I invited him back for this series. He was very resistant to the idea at first because he had kind of moved away from an interest in these long duration performances. So he proposed to do something that he called performances of indefinite duration, where he would do a bunch of different things that would all be under this moniker of a performance, but that were really a number of different performances. So he was working in a form that he called installation, which I think is a word that Alistair MacLennan first proposed, where basically you're, in a way, creating an installation and animating it through your actions over a long period of time. So there's slow transformations in the materials based on what the performer's doing with them. And it was quite a long performance, and it was very interesting. He would work with text and talking with people for a while, and then he was doing these very interesting kind of like patterns on the floor with powders, and he had a skinned goat's head and a mallet and tape, and making very interesting relationships between materials in his body, and then bringing in these very sort of didactic discussions that all centered around it. And there was this real sense that this thing was building in this amazing way, and how is it all going to come together? And then something odd happened. After about 2 hours before the end of the performance, the whole thing fell apart. It's almost like he lost the thread of the performance and didn't know where to go from there. So, of course, there's this funny thing in durational performance where people may show up many times, very few stay for the whole thing, but people think, oh, I'll go to the end. I'll come for the ending, because that we want to see how it ends. They think of something like Tanya's piece where there's going to be this amazing climax. But of course, when people arrived, he was sweeping up the floor and saying, it's over, it's done, I'm finished. And it was an absolutely beautiful performance. It was, the images were stunning, but it had no ending per se. It didn't have, it didn't have that climax that we were all looking for. So this is kind of one of the, dangers of durational performance. We could end up in a place that we can't dig ourselves out of. So then we have to go back to why we're doing it. Is it to entertain an audience, or is it something else? It's something we're learning about or trying. So one of the things Roddy said in his interview is that Boris Nisloni from Germany advocates performance as meeting. It's not wholly the onus of the artist, and it's not wholly the onus of the spectator. It's far more like whatever we decide to do here within these conditions that I've foregrounded is how meaning is generated. So we're trying to orchestrate a meeting of people, a meeting with the space, a meeting with materials, and all of these elements have to cooperate with each other. And if they don't, then it's a bit of a mess of a performance. But we're always looking for that magic moment where, somehow it's really working. Somehow we've managed to attune our awarenesses and come into a good, or good in the sense of meaningful relationship with each other. And you also never know how that meaning is going to manifest itself. So Dorothea, who we're going to see perform in a little while, we met in 2011 in Set. And I was doing a performance there, I think it was 2011. I was doing a performance there where I was asking people where I was listening to people's hearts and asking people to listen to my heart. And I got a lot of feedback from that performance of people who really disliked it because it was such a slow process. We were all in this church, and a lot of people were kind of sitting around, and it takes time to deal with each individual person, and it's a one-on-one action. Of course, you can watch what happens with the other person, but that gets a little boring after a while, and it's really this one-on-one connection that's the performance. So a lot of people felt the performance was designed to fail because they had to wait too long and they got bored and went away. But for Dorothea, who I have to take at her word, and was one of the last people for me to interact with, and we're talking about a couple of hours that this took. For her, it was an important connection, and it was we had a heart. We had in common the fact that we have heart conditions, and it was a very meaningful kind of meeting between the two of us. And when you go deeply into these places of searching for meaning, sometimes the payoff also isn't immediate. I mean, someone may remember or even not remember what it was, but somehow the reverberation will happen. It could be days, weeks, months, years after the event itself, that somehow something changes that was in a way initiated by that action. And I think we have to have a kind of faith as artists that that's going to happen even when you go away and you think, oh, that performance wasn't very good. But then later someone will tell you, years later, oh, I was so affected by that moment. Meaning making is an ongoing process that doesn't really have an ending to the story so much as chapters. So I'm going to move on a little bit now from talking about all these other performances that I curated. So I also did the final piece in that particular Time series, and it was the end of 1999, and there was all this talk about 2000, and I thought, what does 2000 mean? I want to find out what 2000 means in my body. So I decided, what would it mean if I did an action 2000 times? So to mark this momentous change in millennia, I cut out 2000 strips of cloth, and one by one I was running them through different spices and then creating a kind of installation out of them. And each cloth was numbered.
Spice,
different spices like cumin or paprika or, And then at the end of the performance, it took 24 hours to do this. And then at the end of that period of time, I took a thread and I bound my eyes 2,000 times as the audience counted, and then walked backwards through this installation that I'd created. This moment is after it's happened. That's Tanya Mars cutting the threads off of me. And you see she's wearing a mask because the whole building that I did the performance in smelled like a curry factory at that point. So there's me, and then here's just some photos of the installation as it looked when it was completed. So the strips were in each row was 100, and the strips were slowly decreasing in size, so it created this kind of diagonal shape. And each 100 was infused with a different spice, which is what it was in those bowls. And there you can see how I had stamped numbers onto each strip. But the important thing about this performance and how I constructed it was that although I ended up building this beautiful installation, and I should say that because I've never been trained in art, I don't consider myself a visual artist so much. I use the term performance art because I'm not very good at making objects for the most part. But it was a very beautiful sculpture that I created. However, for me, that was kind of a foil. I'll explain that in a minute. Maybe you should.
Foil.
Like a diversion. So for me, the images of the performance often don't capture what is the essential element. In this case, although I was building this sculpture, that was something for people to look at to kind of distract them from what I was really interested in. So what I was interested in was the one-on-one interactions I was having with people as I was doing these slow actions of running the strips through the spice and hanging them. I was having very interesting one-on-one conversations with people. But because I was building this installation, the audience as a whole would be interested in that and the development of that. And so the person I was talking with wouldn't feel like I was kind of pulling them into the spotlight and making them the center of the action. So people could look at this thing I was building as what they were supposed to be watching rather than watching the conversation as if that were the spectacle. Mm-hmm. And I'm also very interested in a different kind of social space that gets created in these long performances where, people may not be paying attention to the performance. They may be on their phones or talking to each other or paying attention to different things in the space. And it creates a different kind of social space to be in where there is a togetherness, but also different kinds of permissions in terms of the way people can react as opposed to in a theatrical space where everybody is there as a spectator. But that's a hard thing to capture in a photograph. You can experience it when you're in the performance, but if that's the real flesh of the performance, it's a very hard thing to document. So I'm going to jump way ahead here. I have so many works I could talk about that I'm not going to. But I'm going to jump ahead. Oh, I was going to tell you about this, though. I guess I should. Okay, so very quickly, I started working with ice after my father-in-law died. I did a performance where I carved a block of ice with the word sacred to the memory of and brought it to the river, the Trent River. It was in Nottingham, because his background was from Latvia, and that river feeds into a sea, which eventually at the other end would be Latvia, Estonia. So this was a way of marking a period of grief for me. And I have a video of this performance that we'll put up on the IPAMIA site, so you can learn more about it. But this set me off on a long series of performances working with big blocks of ice as a way of dealing with grief. So this was a performance I did in Valparaiso, where for 12 hours I walked through the streets of Valparaiso with a slowly melting block of ice wrapped in felt. And what I realized I was really dealing with in terms of grief with this performance was the child. I realized I would never be a father at this point. So I was really grieving for the child or children I had never had. Then I went to Singapore and I did a piece that was supposed to be quite short, and turned into a 75-hour piece by accident. And I called it Normal Life. So this performance began April 11, 2006 as a half-hour presentation as part of Future of Imagination festival in Singapore at Substation. But then there was an accident during the performance that completely changed the work. And as a result, for me, the work continued for several days through the conclusion of the festival on April 14th. So I had this huge block of ice, and I had worked with a block of ice only days earlier in Kuala Lumpur, but it had been substantially, like several inches smaller and thinner. So that was what I was assuming the block of ice I would get in Singapore would be. However, because this one was bigger, it was quite a bit heavier and more difficult to work with. And I only saw the block of ice 5 minutes before my performance started. So I had this image that I was going to kind of embrace this block of ice and roll through the gallery space with it as kind of like a partner almost. And there was this odd window at the bottom of the space through which I had lights projecting from outside, so that when I pulled the piece of ice over, it would be backlit by this light, and it would be so beautiful. But when I started to pull the piece of ice over, it was too heavy and it slipped. And so I tried to grab it, and it smashed my hands into the cement floor. So here I am, about to tip it over, and then there it is smashed. And I was wearing white gloves, which I saw began to bleed a bit. But I had held my hands on the ice for quite a while, so they were quite numb, so I didn't feel very much. But this ice was too big to do what I intended, so the only thing I could do is push it across the floor from the light into the dark end of the space. And then I got to the other end of the space, and there was one chunk of ice that had come off the corner that I sort of placed back to kind of like make the block complete. And then I took off my gloves, which I put on the ice, and a piece of my finger fell off.
No.
So you can see the difference of the one finger. But my most excellent translator here reveals something very important, which was that, so after the performance, of course, I was rushed to the hospital and they took out the bone shards and created a new fingertip for me. They couldn't put the piece of finger back on because it was too crushed. And so then I was wandering around basically for several days with these bandaged fingers, which I was often holding up in the air like this because I take blood thinners because I have a heart issue, and so it was difficult for the blood to clot, so I often had to hold my hands up in the air to kind of like keep the blood from starting to flow again. So in all the other performances, when we're going, you just see, I became this image throughout the festival of like, oh, the guy with the bandaged hands when we're going out to dinner, whatever. And, it's hard not to be a performance in that situation. And of course, everybody's coming up asking, oh, how are you? Or the ones who weren't there asking, what happened, etc. So you become a kind of center of attention, unwanted attention. But of course, I was horrified because just as your reaction, I don't want to put people in trauma. For me, the whole reason I do performance is to make images that kind of deal with trauma or help us overcome trauma or feel better about ourselves or feel more connected. And so I was truly distressed that I had essentially done this action that had traumatized all these people and made them feel like somehow they were implicated in it because they watched it. So I thought, this can't be left to rest like this. So I went to the organizers, Li Wen and Jason Lim, and I said, I need to do another action on the final night. And of course, Li Wen said, as long as it's not with ice. And I said, well, of course it has to be with ice. So they did create a space in the final event to allow me to kind of like do another action. So we had a scanner so I could show people exactly what my hands looked like, and I could show the x-rays. You can see how severe the bruises were on the other end. And so I showed the x-rays, but I had a glass of water, or a glass of ice, which I had bandaged up. And so this bandaged glass, I handed to the first audience member and asked them to warm it with their hands and then pass it to the next person. And so it made its way through the audience with each person warming the ice slowly with their hands. And so for the length of time it took this glass to go through the audience, which was quite large, I had to explain what had happened, apologize for the action, and explain how, sorry I was that I had implicated the audience in this sense of trauma. So if I truly believe that performance is a way of addressing trauma, I had to find an action that could address this trauma. Now, I can't do that by magic, like somehow I can do a performance that regrows my finger. But what I can do is a performance that maybe talks about it and finds something that makes people feel a little less traumatized by what had happened. So I had made a mistake. I had approached this material of the ice not as an equal and not understanding its qualities fully. And so in order to readdress this relationship with the ice, I had to work with the ice on a scale that a human body can safely deal with it. So that's why I could use this small piece of ice that wasn't a danger to anybody, and everybody could contribute to the warming of the ice with their hands. So as I was speaking, the glass was making its way around. Finally, it returned to me. And as I said, because they had been implicated as witnesses in the original trauma, I wanted to provide them with an opportunity to participate in a gesture that would actively provide some relief from that trauma. So then I took the glass, unwrapped it so that people could see on the scanner, created a kind of thing with the bandages, and then I took the water and I drank it, and there was a little piece of ice still left, and I put this in my mouth and held it into my mouth until it melted. So an unintended durational performance where art and life intersect, and where I was trying to think about how can the power and possibility of action through performance address something real happening in our lives. So now I'm aware the time is getting late. It's 1 o'clock.
We need Q&A time a bit.
QA.
Q&A, yes. So perhaps we can open it up for that.
Yeah, so we just do QA.
Yeah.
はい。
リレーショナルパフォーマンスってほとんどの人が直接見るより記録で知ることの方が圧倒的に多いかと思うんですけど、その時にすごくリレーショナルパフォーマンスに関してはロマンチックに感じるんですね。その記録を見た時にですね、長い時間やってるっていうことに対して例えば今回ポールさんのパフォーマンスは見ることできませんでしたけども、例えばやってるっていうのは知ってたので、布団に入るときに今ポールさんアクションしてるんだな、だからそれはなんか自分がこうやって寝てるときも地球が回ってるとか、そういうなんかどっかロマンチックな部分が感じてしまうんですけど、それはアーティスト側としては歓迎すべきことなのか、それともちょっと排除したいものなのか、聞きたいです。
I mean, I'm because I kind of described this talk as talking about dwelling in duration. I would say I'm very much on the side of thinking of it as everyday life as opposed to some momentous special occasion. But there's something powerful in actually taking a period of time and saying, okay, for this period of time, I'm going to be focused in this way. I'm going to have interactions in this way. There's a possibility for types of behavior that are maybe outside of what I would dare to do in my daily life. So I like to think of when I decide, okay, this is a durational performance, that in a way I'm setting up a contract with the world of like, for this period of time, maybe we can behave a little differently. For this period of time, maybe we can stress some aspect of life a little more. Maybe we can honor that time in a different way. Those are always my hopes. I mean, of course, we're flawed, we're human, we make mistakes, we are never as aware as we would hope we would be. And so sometimes it's really magical, sometimes it's a bit more mundane and less romanticized, but what we're trying to do, I think, is open up a possibility to connect to something larger than our habits. And a lot of, I mentioned near the beginning when we were talking about durational performance, often it's associated with repetition, a repeated action, something you do over and over, perhaps in a different rhythm or a slower rhythm than normal. This is all related, I think, to the idea of trance to some extent. And definitely there's an interest in trance in a lot of durational performance. And the thing about trance is, and of course trance is very related to ritual and more, and spiritual practices, etc. And I had a teacher, Linda Putnam, and what she taught me or told me or helped me understand is that trance is the way that the human body is capable of expressing the eternal or the immortal within our mortality. So, because this is not something we talk about every day, of course it sounds very romantic, but I don't think it's romantic per se. I think it's actually there is a connection between the mortal and the immortal, and even though we are in mortal bodies, I think we have a connection to the immortal that we tend to express as romantic because we don't have other terminologies for it. But I think the romance, the idea of romance is a kind of distortion of this actual problem of how do we relate to the immortal as mortal beings.
はいどうぞ。
持続っていうのは時間を言うことだと思うんですけど、特殊相対性理論によると、それぞれのものっていうのは固有の時間があって、それぞれ時間の流れが違うわけなんですが、それを作品さんとか作家に例えると、それらの作家さんと作品っていうのは時間が持続より違うわけですね。それをどのように考えているか、もしくは表現としてそれぞれ時間が違うことによってどういう意味が生じてくるかということを何か考えたりしますか？
I think that's one of the reasons it's so important that we have this sense of meeting and encounter and coming together, because yes, we're all in our slightly different, skewed from each other moments of time, but somehow when we all come together into this room, we create a new entity that is not just in our physical bodies, but there's the space between us, the organism of all of us together is actually a new whole in itself, even if temporary, that shares a time.
その出会いの場によって時間もそれぞれまた昨日の出会いと明日の出会いは時間の流れが違うからです。人が集まる人によって全然時間も変わってくると思います。
So this coming together affects all of us, and some of that is very mundane, organic things like when a performer meets an audience, we actually start to breathe at the same rhythm. When I listen to someone else's heart, my heart actually begins to fall into the rhythm of the other person. These are just autonomic body responses that we as organisms feel and have that are part of our way of syncing up to the world. So one of the ways that we come into shared time is through this very, as I say, mundane kind of obvious organic responsiveness. So I'll let you translate that part. So, but because I believe this intelligence is somehow held through our collective bodies and not just our own individual minds, there's other levels of responsiveness that we aren't necessarily aware of, but that play themselves out in why one person leans in and another person turns away. This is all part of a kind of larger collective intelligence that's in a way it's through our actions that we're exuding time as opposed to time. I don't believe time is a container that we're held within, which is the kind of standard scientific approach, but actually time exudes from us through our actions. We generate time through our being. This is the kind of dangerous thinking that durational performance leads you to. They're not laughing. Thank you for your attention and interest.
じゃあすいません。次にスイッチしてまいりますけど。